Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. I'm Philip Ideson. I'm joined, as always, today by my co-host, Fine-Tune CEO, Rich Ham. So, Rich, thanks for joining me.
It is my pleasure, as always, Phil.
So in episode 5, Rich and I chatted with Brian Kyle, who's Vice President, Supply Chain and Accounts Payable at American Cancer Society, about his experiences in running a procurement organization in a mission-driven environment. Today, we thought we'd reflect on how many procurement organizations find themselves where they are, at the kind of the crossroads that we're at, where we're measured oftentimes only by savings, and savings that might not even drop to the bottom line. Now, to join us for this conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Rob Hills. Rob is the CEO of Hills Advisory Services, having spent nearly 24 years at Deloitte, most recently as a partner leading their West Coast supply chain organization and as head of Deloitte's aviation and airline practice. I think we were talking just before we started here and rolled the tape. It's fair to say that Rob has seen it all over his career in procurement and supply chain. So, Rob, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, is there anything I've missed there on the introduction into your background? I'd love to give listeners a little bit more context into some of your background that really provides the foundation of the conversation that we're going to have today.
Well, Phil, I'll summarize it because if you let me, I'll go on for way longer than your podcast would allow. But I'll say this. I started in the engineering field. So I was a design engineer for what's now Honeywell Aerospace. It spent, I'm going to say, the better part of my career in the mid 80s to the early 90s in that role. But quickly went into the consulting world. A.T. Kearney after that during the 90s and early 2000s. 2000s to the end of my career. I retired at Deloitte just this past year as a partner. The interesting part of that is I always sort of fell back on my engineering roots through all of that. And from the procurement perspective, I was up and down the spectrum of the types of categories. A lot of it was direct materials. So for Deloitte and even at A.T. Kearney, a lot of what I did was the direct material side. But the indirect side was always the interesting one in terms of changes and how you approached it. So yeah, the full end of the spectrum from a procurement perspective.
Now, that time at A.T. Kearney, I think you said the mid to the late 90s, that was really a formative time in the professionalization of procurement, I think. A lot of the work that ATK did at that time became what we now know as the sourcing process, the category management process. And in some ways hasn't really changed much since today. We're still operating under some of those same processes that were built, 25 plus years ago now?
Some firm, so there was a 7-step process that A.T. Kearney came up with. I would say those guys, it was a little slightly before my time when all that started, but those were the inception days of what has become called strategic sourcing. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the 7-step process is, for other firms, they make a 6-step version, and another firm uses a 5-step version. That regardless, it's the same steps. It's just sort of amalgamated into different groupings. But those guys, the original, if you remember, Ignacio Perez at Volkswagen working with A.T. Kearney and the work that was done at Sears back in the day, that was the original sort of strategic sourcing processes that A.T. Kearney adopted. And I was sort of happy and sort of proud to sort of be part of those initial days back at A.T. Kearney when we were using that.
Yeah, and so many of the team from those years went on to do a lot of things in the procurement supply chain space. It was a very tight-knit community, I think. I came in just about the turn of the century, so 2000, into automotive, and a lot of the work that we were doing was based on what ATK had really built.
Rob,
turn of the century. Yeah, I was well in my cup, beyond that before your time, Phil. So, but yeah, it's exactly right. A lot of those initial sort of, I'll say, processes or concepts really were sort of adopted early on in the 90s.
If you guys were to sit for an hour and share stories, that hour would quickly turn to 6 hours, I have a feeling. Rob, framing up the discussion a little bit for today, you and I have talked a couple times building up to this discussion. And so I know that you're aware that we're exploring certain flaws in the ways that procurement departments and the individuals within them tend to be incentivized. And numerous of those flaws, as you and I have discussed, revolve around the lack of mechanisms and scorekeeping, frankly, related to measuring and tracking the actual impact of the initiatives that procurement runs. And when you first heard about this project and specifically kind of that element of it, what parts of your career, if any, did it remind you of? What were your thoughts? What were your reactions as we described the project to you?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think of it as bookends of the career, right? The concept of how clients, as I went through this, were incented. Even before that, even when I was working in industry, saw the same things. The way the types of deals have been restructured over time has certainly changed. A lot of the incentives, though, haven't. And what you'll still see some of the incentives that are in place. And I go back to, Rich, some of the initial conversations that we had brokered between the CFO and the CPO, Chief Procurement Officer versus the Chief Financial Officer. And the Chief Procurement Officer would plant a victory flag on the work that he or she had done in order to support the incentives that were in front of them. And they had done everything they said they were going to do per those incentives, per those measures, I'll say. And as part of that, the CFO would look at it and no impact to the budgets, and in fact, negative impact in many cases. And so you'd have to sort of go back and sort of relook at, well, are we incenting people the right way? And sort of there was a lot of work, I'm going to say, particularly in the 2000s, where we're actually putting scorecards in place. And even with those, it was difficult. There was in many cases, like I'll say, squeezing a balloon, to use an analogy. You'd find one piece of the equation that you would address, only to find that it would manifest in higher costs than somewhere else. We probably will go through the examples, but those are I can just remember those conversations, Rich, where everything was done per the plans for a CPO, and the CFO just wouldn't see the result.
Phil, I know you're going to have follow-up questions here, but before we go on, I have to pause and acknowledge how much I love this metaphor of planting the savings flag. And the planting of the savings flag so often happens before the lands have been conquered. It's like we're going to plant this flag and then we're going to attack. We're going to invade. But first, let's plant the flag. I love that.
You shot the bullet. It may have hit the target, but you don't know. But you planted the flag. That's exactly right. And to use probably a war parody, as you suggest, but it's that was often what you always saw.
Now, did you find that there was a disconnect between CFO and CPO on what the incentive should be, or a misunderstanding and misalignment of those incentives? Or it was just truly that the incentives were aligned in these cases, which was to save money. The CFO just wasn't showing the evidence that the CPO presented that existed.
Let me give 3-4 examples maybe of what I mean there, and then you guys have probably seen them. And as an example, you would see like a typical procurement organization looking at average invoice price last year versus average invoice price this year and focus on that. But it doesn't look at the increase in spending on whatever good or service that was. So you'll see like the impact to the budgets associated as an increase, but what you paid for per eaches, what you paid per hour, what you paid for, and the individual elements of what you're paying for, whatever the good or service, would actually increase what the CFO would be seeing. Another example might be you're focused on rate cards for something, but you're not looking at all the other elements of costs associated. So you're truly focused on rate cards of, like, say, dollars per hour or dollars per receipt or whatever the service might be. But you can add 3 other people to the good or service, and the sales guys would still be hitting their margins, in fact, increasing them, but you're still playing to this rate card play. So those examples would be where you said you would do something to the CFO. The CFO would say, great, let's get that. So it's not like there was a misalignment in between the CFO and the CPO originally. They just weren't seeing the result of it because it wasn't holistic. So it was the kind of thing where you had to start to rethink the deals and how you actually had to measure them. So it kind of got to a lot of the risk share deals that sort of came up. I saw a lot of those right after 9/11. There was a bunch where we were thinking there was going to be a big recession as a result of 9/11. There kind of wasn't. But then 2008, the financial crisis then, for the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, that sort of thing, you saw a lot of it there. And a lot of that work was really sort of based on what we used to call black ink deals back in the day. Another name for it would be just sort of turnaround work, where you're looking at a client that's in bankruptcy and you're trying to find whatever you can do to fix it. They don't have any money to pay you. So you got to find out what kind of deal you could put in place in order for them to win and you to win, and actually measure in a specific way to win over and actually achieve what you're trying to achieve, both on the financial side as well as the performance side.
Rob, as you talk about this, these conversations between the CPO and the CFO, and then the CFO sometimes, despite the best of intentions of procurement, the CFO's going, where are the results on my P&L? Where did it go? And I think, and this is harkening back to some conversations you and I've had in the build up here too, is that, we recognize that there's always been some sort of gap between what gets negotiated and what happens, what gets executed. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what you've witnessed. My observation, I wonder if it's consistent with yours, has been that over the last 15 years or so, as corporate procurement resources were leaned out post Great Recession, as resources were reallocated in many organizations, that negotiation execution gap has perhaps grown because of those factors, leaning out of resources, reallocated resources, and suppliers taking note of those vulnerabilities and kind of pouncing. Does that ring any bells for you? Is it consistent with your experience over the last 15 years or so?
Yeah, I think what you're touching on there a little, Rich, is the capability of the staff and the sort of dispersion of focus of staff in many cases during the negotiation process. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, and stop me if I am.
No, in part, for sure.
I guess my observation is the following. If you look at how you've got procurement professionals who are focused on the negotiation in the past, who spent more time on a given category, that truly understood the category end to end, it was much better in the moment of the negotiations and finalizing the contract to make sure all of the ends, the loose ends were tied. I don't want to suggest that the professionals are not doing what they're good at, not analytical or bad at what they do. What I'm suggesting is I guess 2 things. One, over the years, they've got fewer professionals over a larger amount of spend and categories. That's one sort of thing, my observation. The other is the type of work, or the division of the labor's work to support that the negotiation has been moved. So in a lot of cases, they'll say, well, we want to do a lot of analysis on this particular category, this particular contract, or whatever it is. The analysis itself, in many cases, is shipped overseas, offshore. So a lot of it is the work is done, but it's done by someone else, and you're looking at the results of it. And so therefore, you could spend more time on other categories and more spend, you don't get into the nitty-gritty details of the analysis, and you sort of miss some things. So there's a lot there when you start getting into AI now that sort of helps to support a lot of that. But over the years, there's been a lot of that where you're just getting results of contracts. And I'll say, on the other side of the negotiating table, those sales guys are good at this. They know exactly they've been doing 20 years, the same sales channels. They know exactly what levers to pull and buttons to push. And someone who's just new to the category may not know them. So it's my observation is just sort of a diffusion of focus on a category and like how you're spending more time on many more categories, just to kind of give some numbers. As I remember, direct material stuff that I used to do, you'd be maybe say $40 million per head, in the procurement world. In the IT space, which is really sort of complicated, again, maybe $45-50 million per. You get into the general categories, you're getting around $200 million to spend plus over a number of categories. And a lot of them are not spend under managed categories. So it's the kind of thing where certain categories where you just have people who don't spend enough time on it, they won't be able to get the contract in place that really covers all those loose ends I mentioned.
In those latter areas, Rob, I got to imagine in recent years, given the diffusion of resources that you talked about, the suppliers are winning, for lack of a better way of putting it. There has to have been a gradual shift in the power dynamic between buyers and sellers, with sellers kind of claiming the upper hand slowly but surely in recent years. Is that a fair statement? Do you agree with that?
Certain types of deals that come into the industry that are new to the suppliers or the sales guys on the supply side, that throw them for a loop and they lose it first and they quickly figure it out and they find a way around it. That's my view. But it's the risk-based deals was one, and things related to deals where there was a better. The big analytics days, I'm going to call that in the mid 2000s through the mid-teen 2000s, like 2005 through 2015, 16, right in there. You had big data that you could apply to do things like target costing or should costing analysis that a lot of the consulting agencies brought to clients, and then they started bringing their own people to do it. In those particular cases, the sales guys couldn't get away with saying, hey, our costs have gone up 5%, therefore we need to increase our prices 5%. And so they would say, well, we want it to only be 3%. And so that would be a negotiated win for the buyer. But the reality was the cost had only gone up 2%. So really it's a 1% increase. So it's the kind of thing where the target sort of should costing analysis would look at the inputs, or sort of the parameters of the good or service, and you could monitor the trends of those things and actually predict what those prices are going to be. When you start getting into that kind of analysis, that sort of threw the sales guys for a loop. They're still better at this, I would say, but when you start getting into that kind of analysis and using data like that, you have a much better position from a negotiation perspective.
Now, I think we started the conversation talking about the gap between what a CPO will claim in savings versus what a CFO might see, and how that drives the perception of procurement and the impact of procurement. And one of those reasons that we talked about, there's definitely we continue to see the trend of doing more with less, and we at Art of Procurement talk to a lot of folks who have got some data on that as well right now, and it's a continuing kind of theme that I don't think will change anytime soon. But there's also the achievement of savings that were in a contract, but actually achieving them. So post-contract kind of savings, or scope creep, or suppliers finding other ways to not necessarily adhere to the contracts that they put in place, or find ways to bring costs in afterwards. What are some of the ways that, well, one, is that something that you've observed as well, kind of post-contract signing? And then if it is, any advice or tips that you can give on how do you kind of minimize the impact of a supplier maybe trying to find ways to bring in additional sources of revenue post contract signing that may erode some of the savings that you negotiated?
Say even beyond just additional sources of revenue, like you're trying to find some other service that you can sell around this or upsell is kind of what I think you're suggesting. In those, there was a lot of deals where, like on the freight side, where you had thousands of transactions a month, maybe several hundred a day, and you would get duplicate billing, or you revert back to the old contract that's in your system, or one of the divisions didn't get the memo, whatever it might have been. It's with the high transaction volumes, there was a lot you just couldn't keep up with. So you'd have to do, like on the distribution side, you would do freight audits and that sort of thing. You have to go back and look through all those details. Like I said, when you get to AI and you get to a lot of the big data stuff and you can sort of validate a lot of that, that's sort of solved a lot of those. But over the years, a big part of what we did at Deloitte and even at Kearney was we would just go back through their data and find stuff on the table that they just overbilled for. It wasn't nefarious. It was just the kind of things where it was just mistakes made. And it was typically things we could come back and get rebates over time.
Rob, given the diffusion, a phase in your career a couple weeks ago where you found yourself doing quite a bit more in the way of value-based or contingency-based engagements. And of course, in those kinds of engagements, you noted that more exacting post-deal validation is necessary because you're always having to illustrate to a customer, here's what happened. And some of those moments where you're trying to illustrate it are hard because the landscape changes and you have to normalize for changes to the landscape. I wonder if you could share some insights or stories around the challenges that you wrestled with, doing those sorts of engagements.
Yep, I'll try to be brief in some of these because some of these deals are just really interesting. So value-based deal is a term that's sort of become popular over the last, say, 10, 20 years. But back in the day, like I said, when we did black ink programs, we would try to set up what we just called sharing the risk of the value, risk share agreements, whatever you wanted to call them. The first one that I remember was wildly successful for the work that we did. It was the kind of thing where we set it up. We had to measure it a certain way. We put the measures in place and spent a lot of time like looking at making sure there wasn't any holes, the Swiss cheese approach, if you want to use that term, where you're looking for where we can actually find it. Over the years, though, I guess what I'd say is when it wasn't an environment where we had to have, a lot of, there was no, the economic issues weren't such that clients didn't have money. They just wanted to continue to do the risk shield deals because they liked them. In those cases, there was times where we set up deals where there was just too much risk on our side. And so we would do 100% at-risk deals where we did a dime until we actually got money for them. As you guys probably know, for a procurement cycle to happen and to actually receive the value on the front end of that it takes several months, maybe a year in some cases, to actually receive the value on their side before they start paying you. So these risk share deals were like 5 years long. And it would, like you just mentioned, Rich, those deals where, to measure them over 5 years and actually get value over that time, that means you got to validate or have someone assigned to come back every 6 months or something and actually go through the books with them and then get paid that way. It was really difficult in those particular times. So that was the other end of the spectrum where at first we had wildly successful deals where there was a risk share premium, I'll call it, for the consultancies or the people doing the work with the clients, up to where we put deals in place where it was just almost impossible to get paid. Or not impossible, but very difficult to get paid. And so over time, the risk share deals kind of smarter, and it kind of got to we were smarter about what we would share in terms of risk, and we put lots of calculations in place in order to agree to a specific deal. Those kinds of deals now are, I mean, clients have sort of adopted them and just like commonplace. I mean, a lot of times clients will want to adopt those because it incents the consultancy that's working with you to do the right thing. It also incents their side to do the work such that they're getting the value that they wanted out of it. So that's kind of where it's sort of now settled into risk share deals for the most part.
Rob, over the last 15 years or so, and I think I suppose we could even stretch that timeline back to the turn of the millennium. What's your observation on the procurement department's reputation within the business? How has that evolved? Is it about the same as it ever was? Is it better than it ever was? Is it worse? Has it deteriorated as resources have dwindled and the power dynamics between buyers and sellers have shifted? What have you observed?
So I've had the opportunity and the pleasure, I'll say, of working in a lot of different industries. And so the answer to that question, Rich, is different depending on the industry. I mean, if you work in some industries, there's a handful of guys in procurement that make or break the margin, right? I mean, those guys they spend a lot of time and effort getting and managing inventory in and managing inventory out, buying the right deals. So the level of importance of procurement in an organization like that is off the charts high. Then I'll sort of revert back to, in many cases, in past years, I'll say this as affectionately as I can, but indirect procurement in some organizations was where elephants go to die. It was like the I'll say guys and gals, people that were working in an organization that they didn't know what to do with them. They would put them in an indirect procurement because it wasn't that hard to do. And that was the view. I disagree with the sentiment, but that was the view. So there was, in many cases, you didn't have the highest talent, or it would be an organization that you would bring in the newest people, and they would start there as sort of an entry platform into the organization and move out into the organization from there as they learn things. A good place to do that, by the way. But my view is the perception of procurement then, at least in the past, that's how it was. Now with like the data that I mentioned and the level of analytics required to do the work, I would say in more recent times, the level of sophistication required for a lot of that work, you can't just hand it to anybody. The example of the should costing I mentioned analysis, that is a multivariate analytics approach that uses a lot of higher level and statistics in order to support that work. That's not something you can just hand to anybody. That's usually you have to have a fairly sophisticated math background for that. You have to understand, be able to break down the intermediaries in the supply chain. You have to be able to break down the complexities of the good or service or the product that you're buying. So, in my view of at least the clients that I've been working with, the level of perception of those kind of analytics have moved the procurement group up in the perception of the business.
It's interesting when you talk about the direct versus indirect as well. So I started my career in the UK in direct materials. In the UK and Europe, oftentimes indirect was seen as the place to be. And the directs were the place where you kind of buying off a specification, you've got a process, people have to engage with you. there's a lot more nuance in indirect. And then I moved over to the States and it was the opposite. As you explained, Rob, what you would see in terms of indirect being, not seen as with the same of focus as direct materials was. As we...
Maybe that's a U.S. thing.
Yeah, I think it was very geographic.
Sure, Phil, if that's but it was it was, well, you guys buy paper clips and paper and that sort of thing. Yeah, what's the big deal? I'm not suggesting that is the case by any stretch, but it's how hard could security purchases be? You just hire them and they come in and look after things. Oh. So yeah, I mean,
it was just a very interesting observation.
Perception anymore.
Yeah, it was just a very interesting observation for me moving from the UK, where I was at that point in indirects, and indirects being this is the place where you want to be, and you come over here, and it was like, there wasn't that level of. I went back into direct materials when I came into the States to start with.
Well, and Phil and Rob, my firm, for 23 plus years now, is only focused not only on just indirect, but indirect services. So we're out at the most highly complex end of the spectrum of expenses where the negotiation execution gap is greatest. And I think it stands to reason, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Rob, but it kind of sounded like in some ways you were saying it is in that area where the reputation of the procurement practitioner is probably most at risk, often because there's the highest likelihood of their efforts not manifesting in the P&L as intended, not delivering stakeholder value as intended. And if the practitioner would get better at enforcing their efforts to ensure that they are working and validating that they're actually manifesting in the P&L, that would elevate those practitioners' reputation. Is that do I have that right, Rob?
Couldn't agree with you more. I'll say this, particularly on the indirect services side. I recently wrote a paper. It's out there on the internet if you want to look it up. But it's on the indirect services side. You'd have a diversity of places across the nation, maybe even across the globe, where you've got contracts in place for some indirect service. It could be something simple. It could be pest control or janitorial, or it could be something that's a little more complex around security or whatever it is. In those cases, a lot of the operations guys and those groups would just fire that vendor. And now the indirect services person has to do miracles to get some service in place in order to support that and have it meet the strategic direction that you're trying to maintain within that category. Yeah, those guys are just busy as heck, and they're just trying to manage that and keep things on the hook for contracts and then maintain the strategy for cost reductions and then maintain the strategy for quality of service. Yeah, all of those, Rich. I couldn't agree more.
And if I can just add one thing as well, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about doing more with less and how you would have, $40, $50 million per buyer. And then you look at services and suddenly that number explodes because you just have a broad range of services you have responsibility for.
Yeah, just paper clips, Bill.
Yeah, I know.
Like, what's the big deal?
I was a services buyer. And so I would have travel and catering and marketing and contingent labor, all those categories, under just a big bucket of services. And you can't be an expert in all of those at the same time. And so it's no wonder that you're just using a process to try and find market price, for example, as opposed to knowing how to actually manage those post-contract or knowing where all the levers are and things like that. So you just get seen as being a transactional it's just a transactional role you're playing to run a process.
Well, and Phil, I would say you couldn't become an expert in all those services even if you had 10 years managing all those categories. But as Rob just said, you're getting promoted out of the department in 2 years if you're good, and so that's part of the conundrum is you have this constant revolving door in some of the most complex areas of expense, which obviously leaves the suppliers with a massive upper hand.
Now, I know it's about
the sales guys stay whole career, and they know all the tricks.
Amen.
So yeah, it's tough.
So I know it's about time to wrap up. I just had one final question, Rob, and that was, we're talking about incentives in this series, and I'm thinking about incentives for procurement. Where you've seen examples in your career, the procurement, the impact of procurement is truly valued within an organization. Are there any specific measures, KPIs, incentives, or anything that you've kind of seen which have driven that perception of procurement?
seen a couple of really interesting, I'll call them practices that have been introduced recently. When I say recently, the last, say, 5 years or so. One is, there's kinds of services that where you don't really have a good or service that's delivered. It might be like a consulting engagement or an engineering engagement or something like the study or whatever it is, where you're just delivering a study and it's hard to know if what the cost of it is right or not. You can't determine. It's because some firm to the next is very different. In some cases, what a lot of the firms will do, a good procurement person will do, is rather than leave it up to just like negotiate from a $500,000 contract to $400,000, leave it at 5, get a rebate for the 100, and then put that into a budget that's separate from that the CFO can actually see.
Yeah.
The actual value that the procurement people brought. And that then becomes an increase to the value that the CPO brought. So the CPOs never sort of thought about that when we started the beginning of this flow. Was you don't really see that negotiated discount, but this is something you actually point at as value. Mm-hmm. And so some of the others kind of get to actually taking a more holistic view on the target or should costing analysis that we mentioned and actually predict what we think the pricing should be for a good or service. It's not simple to do, but it's the kind of thing where if you're incented to do that, a much better position from a negotiation perspective, and you're measuring the specifics of the individual I'll call them intricacies of the category. Yeah, those two things kind of get the most value in my view over the past couple of years.
All right. Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, for sharing with us and with our audience, a lot of different perspectives and thoughts and really digging back into your experience. So we truly appreciate you joining us today.
Nice seeing you guys.